Part 1 left people unable to sleep. We read every comment. You asked for more, you shouldn't have. Some of these women never flinched. Some laughed. All of them changed history forever. This is Crime Lens. Case 1. Eva Dugan. The trapdoor dropped. Then a sound no one in that room ever forgot. February 21st, 1930. Florence, Arizona, USA. Eva Dugan was 52 years old. Press called her cheerful Eva, and that's exactly what she was. She sang on her way to the gallows. She told guards not to hold her arms so tight because the people will think I'm afraid. She was 5'10" and had never shown fear. The hangman miscalculated. Eva had been hired in January 1927 as a housekeeper for Andrew Mathis, a 65-year-old deaf chicken rancher outside Tucson. He fired her after 2 weeks. Then he disappeared. Eva fled with a young man she called Jack, sold Mathis's car in Kansas City for $600, telling the buyer she was Mrs. Andrew Mathis and her husband needed surgery money. Months later, a tourist camping on the Mathis property drove a tent stake into the ground and hit something. It was a shallow grave. The body was wrapped in lime. A gag was still in its teeth. Eva claimed Jack had done it. Jack was never found. The night before her execution, guards found a bottle of raw ammonia in her bunk and 3 razor blades hidden in the collar of her dress. She had planned to escape death on her own terms. She was searched. All options removed. 5 women were in the witness gallery that morning. The first time women had been allowed to witness an Arizona execution. 2 of them fainted. At 5:11 a.m., the trap was sprung. Eva's body dropped, but the miscalculated rope, combined with her height and weight, produced a force that snapped her head from her body. Her botched execution was so horrifying that Arizona abolished hanging and replaced it with the gas chamber 4 years later. Eva was buried at 3 p.m. in the beaded jazz dress she had sewn herself. Case 2. Roxalana Druse. She was a small woman. That was the problem. The suspension hanging was designed to jerk the prisoner upward and snap the neck. For Roxalana Druse, it didn't snap anything. She strangled for 15 minutes. Through the black hood, witnesses heard muffled shrieks. February 28, 1887. Herkimer County, New York, USA. Roxalana Druse was about 40 years old. She had been described by neighbors as dominant by nature, the one who ruled the household. Her husband William, a farmer described by some as shiftless and lazy, had allegedly been abusive. On December 18, 1884, she decided it would end. At the breakfast table, a furious argument erupted. Roxalana retrieved a .22 revolver, hid it under her apron, and whispered to the young men in the house to go outside. Her daughter Mary placed a rope around William's neck while he sat in his chair. Roxalana fired. He fell sideways. The gun misfired on the second shot. She called her nephew back inside and forced him, at gunpoint, to shoot his uncle. He fired. William was still alive. So Roxalana picked up the axe beside the stove and struck him in the head. Then she severed his head entirely, while she and her daughter spent the next day dismembering the body and burning it in the kitchen stove. She hid the head in a sack of wheat in the corner. The young boys in the house were reportedly playing checkers. The ashes and charred bones were poured into the pigsty. The head was later found in the wheat. Her botched execution so disturbed New York officials that it led directly to the abolition of hanging in the state. The electric chair followed in 1890. She was the last woman hanged in New York. Before she died, she signed an affidavit swearing her daughter was entirely innocent. The next woman operated on a different scale entirely. Case 3. Catherine Deshayes. She pushed the crucifix away. The priests offered last rites. She shoved them back. The crowd at the Place de Grève watched as she was chained to the stake, still fighting. February 22, 1680. Paris, France. Catherine Deshayes, known to all of Paris as La Voisin, the neighbor, was approximately 40 years old. She wore a crimson velvet robe embroidered with gold eagles. It had cost 1,500 livres. She had bought it for her public performances. She wore it to her death. La Voisin had begun as a midwife and fortune teller. Over 2 decades, she built a criminal empire beneath the surface of Louis XIV's Paris. She sold inheritance powders, arsenic-based poisons, to nobility who wanted inconvenient husbands or rivals removed. She provided abortions. She ran black masses in a private chapel, with a defrocked priest performing rituals over a living altar. One witness claimed fetuses were burned in a furnace on the property and buried in her garden. Estimates of victims connected to her network range from 1,000 to 2,500 people. Among her clients was Madame de Montespan, the king's own mistress. She allegedly sought love potions to maintain Louis XIV's affection and poisons to eliminate rivals. The investigation, known as the Affair of the Poisons, threatened to reach the throne itself. Louis XIV eventually ordered the inquiry closed to protect the crown. La Voisin refused every offer of final prayer. She was described as alcohol-hardened throughout months of imprisonment and interrogation. Even under the water torture, forced to drink massive quantities of water, she held for weeks before confessing. At the stake, she struggled until the flames took her. The Affair of the Poisons lasted years after her death. Over 400 suspects were investigated. 36 were executed. She died fighting. And the next woman disposed of her victims more quietly. The 1600s to 1800s were the golden age of arsenic poisoning. It was called inheritance powder for a reason. It was colorless, odorless, and nearly impossible to detect before modern forensics. Doctors routinely misdiagnosed arsenic deaths as typhoid, cholera, or heart failure. It is estimated that tens of thousands of people across Europe may have died at the hands of poisoners who were never caught, tried, or even suspected. The cases in this documentary represent only those who were found out. Case 4. Amelia Dyer. At the moment of her arrest, she said 4 words that became one of the most chilling admissions in the history of English crime. "You'll know all mine by the tape around their necks." June 10th, 1896. Newgate Prison, London, England. Amelia Dyer was 57 years old, a trained nurse, a trained midwife, and for over 20 years, a baby farmer. That was the Victorian euphemism for a woman who accepted payments from desperate unmarried mothers to take their infants and care for them. Most of those infants were never seen again. She advertised in newspapers as a warm, motherly widow seeking a child for company and home comfort. Mothers paid up to £80, a small fortune, believing their children were being loved. Amelia strangled them with white edging tape. She wrapped them in brown paper parcels or stuffed them into carpet bags with bricks and dropped them into the Thames. In April 1896, a bargeman found a brown parcel in the river. tapping had a faint address. Police tracked it to a Mrs. Harding in Reading. When detectives raided her home, there were no bodies, but the smell of decomposition was overwhelming in every room. Over 20 years of suspected baby farming, forensic estimates of Amelia Dyer's victims range from 6 confirmed cases to over 400. When confronted, she eventually signed a written confession to clear her son-in-law. She never showed remorse for the infants themselves. At trial, the jury deliberated for 4.5 minutes. In the condemned cell, she filled 5 exercise books with what she called her last true and only confession. When asked on the scaffold if she had anything to say, she replied, "I have nothing to say." She was hanged at 9 a.m. on June 10th, 1896, and the next woman walked to her death twice before she actually died. Case 5. Barbara Graham. They stopped her execution twice in one morning. At 10 a.m., she was ready. At 10:45 a.m., she was ready again. By 11:28 a.m., she had stopped being ready and started being something else entirely. June 3rd, 1955. San Quentin Prison, California, USA. Barbara Graham was 31 years old. The press called her Bloody Babs. She had red hair, a frail build, and a gift for finding the wrong people. She had married 3 times, served 5 years for perjury, worked the naval bars up and down the California coast, and in 1953 found herself involved in a plan to rob a 64-year-old widow named Mabel Monahan at her home in Burbank. The plan was simple. Mabel's son-in-law, a Las Vegas gambler, had supposedly hidden $100,000 in her house. Barbara would knock on the door. She'd say her car broke down. She just needed to use the phone. Monahan opened the door. The men rushed in. She screamed. She was beaten, bound, dragged to a closet, suffocated with a pillow. They found no money. They left empty-handed, missing $15,000 in jewelry in a purse 3 feet away. While awaiting trial, Barbara offered a fellow inmate $25,000 for a fake alibi. The inmate was a police informant. An undercover officer posed as her contact, recorded her admitting she was at the scene, and that recording was played to the jury. On the morning of her execution, 2 separate stays arrived. She'd been prepared to die, unstrapped, prepared again, unstrapped again. When the 3rd call finally came, she said, "Why do they torture me? I was ready to go at 10 o'clock. She asked for a blindfold. She didn't want to see the observers' faces through the gas chamber windows. Her last words, "Good people are always so sure they're right." She walked to the chamber, as if dressed for a shopping trip. Case 6. Gesche Gottfried. On the scaffold, she was handed a glass of wine, a final Bremen custom. She took one slow sip. Then she turned and offered the glass to the presiding judges. It is not recorded whether they accepted. April 21st, 1831. Cathedral Square, Bremen, Germany. Gesche Gottfried was 45 years old. She was known throughout Bremen as the Angel because for 14 years she had nursed every dying person in her life with devotion, prayer, and tears. Those people included her mother, her father, her twin brother, 2 daughters, a son, 2 husbands, a fiancé, 2 close friends, a neighbor, a landlady, a music teacher, a maid, and the maid's young daughter. All 15 died under her care. All 15 were poisoned with mouse butter, a mixture of arsenic and lard spread onto their food. She had learned the method from a common rat-killing remedy. She applied it to human beings for over 14 years. The first was her husband in 1813. She killed him because he was spending the family inheritance. Then she killed her own mother, her father, her children one by one over 5 months in 1815 to clear the path for a new marriage. Then her twin brother when he returned from war and asked for his share of the inheritance. Then her second husband shortly after the wedding to take his estate. She never stopped being the angel. She nursed every victim through their agonizing death, publicly weeping at their bedsides, earning comfort from the community that had no idea she was the cause. She was caught in 1828 when a dinner guest noticed white powder on his food. A doctor confirmed arsenic. She was the last person publicly executed in Bremen. A stone marks the exact spot in Cathedral Square where her head fell. Local custom is to spit on it. They still do. Case 7. Julia Fazekas. By the time the gendarmes reached her door, she had already brewed the solution. She drank it herself. Her death took hours. She chose agony over the courtroom. November 1929, Nagyrev, Hungary. Julia Fazekas arrived in the village of Nagyrev in 1911. Nobody knew where she had come from. Her husband was already missing. She presented herself as the closest thing the village had to a doctor and began performing abortions and fortune-telling. Then the war started. When the men of Nagyrev left for World War I, Allied prisoners of war were held in nearby camps. The women of the village took lovers. When the war ended and the husbands came home, expecting their old lives back, the women went to Fazekas. She had a solution. She boiled strips of flypaper in water and skimmed off the concentrated arsenic residue. She taught the women how to administer it. Over the next 18 years, a quiet massacre unfolded in Nagyrev. Husbands, brothers, sons, elderly parents who had become a burden. The village clerk, Fazekas' own cousin, filed the death certificates as illness, drowning, alcoholism. One woman, Marie Cardos, recalled how her 23-year-old son sang a sweet song while dying from the poison she had given him. She described the memory with what investigators called delight. In 1929, an anonymous letter to a local newspaper triggered an investigation. Within a week, 38 women were arrested in a single day. Eventually, nearly 100. Detectives found arsenic in 46 of the first 50 bodies they exhumed. Julia Fazekas never stood trial. When she heard the gendarmes coming, she drank her own poison. 8 of the women received death sentences. The village of Nagyrev, today described as pastoral, has erased most of the memories. The river Tiza still runs through it. The next woman hid her victims in a flower garden. Case 8. Minnie Dean. A railway guard saw her board the train with a baby in her arms and a hat box in her hand. When she got off, the baby was gone. The hat box was suspiciously heavy. August 12, 1895. Winton, New Zealand. Williamina Minnie. Dean was 50 years old. She was the first, and remains the only, woman legally hanged in New Zealand. She ran a baby farming business from a small cottage on 22 acres called the Larches, accepting infants from unmarried mothers who had no other options. She was known in the area for one thing above all else: her beautiful flower garden, lush dahlias, full chrysanthemums. She had buried children in it. On April 30th, 1895, Minnie traveled to Bluff to collect 1-year-old Dorothy Edith Carter. She returned with the child and an empty hat box. 2 days later, she boarded a train carrying Dorothy in the hat box. and at some point during the journey, the child disappeared into it. At the next station, she collected a 1-month-old girl named Eva Hornsby. A railway guard saw her board with both a baby and the now heavy hatbox. She disembarked with only the hatbox. Both infants were later found buried in her flower garden, alongside the skeleton of a boy estimated to be about 4 years old. Cause of death unknown. Minnie had told police the earphone hatbox contained flower bulbs. The woman who gave her the plants confirmed they were only small cuttings, nothing that could account for the hatbox's weight. Morphine was found in Minnie's bedroom. The M. Gray signature in the local poison register was identified as her own handwriting. She went to the gallows without a flinch or falter. When asked if she had anything to say, she replied, "No, I have nothing to say except that I am innocent." The flowers above the graves were still blooming. Case 9. Lavinia Fisher. She stood at the gallows in a white wedding dress. She scanned the crowd of 2,000 people. She was looking for a man, any man, willing to marry her on the spot. If she could find one, the law would spare her. No one stepped forward. February 18th, 1820. Charleston, South Carolina, USA. Lavinia Fisher was 27 years old and was later dubbed America's first female serial killer, though that title is historically disputed. What isn't disputed, she and her husband John ran the 6-mile Wayfarer house 6 miles north of Charleston, and guests who checked in sometimes didn't check out. The method, at least according to legend, involved Lavinia serving tea laced with a sedative to guests she had charmed into conversation. Once unconscious in the upstairs room, a lever-operated trapdoor would drop the bed and the guest into a pit below. John would finish the job with a knife. 2 human skeletons were found on the property. When traveler John Peoples arrived at the inn, Lavinia initially said there was no room, then invited him for tea. Something about her manner made him dump the tea when she turned away. She discovered a room for him. That night, suspicious, he slept in a chair. He was woken by the sound of the bed crashing into the pit below. He escaped through a window and rode to Charleston. Police arrived the next morning. Lavinia was tried not for murder, but for highway robbery, a capital offense. The judge ruled they would hang John first, making Lavinia a widow and therefore eligible for execution. Standing on the gallows after John dropped, Lavinia turned to the crowd. Her final words, "If anyone has a message for the devil, tell me now. I will be seeing him shortly." She reportedly jumped before the executioner could open the drop. Case 10. Daisy De Melker. Her bones showed pink. That was the arsenic. Strychnine had turned the skeletal remains of her husband's a distinctive shade that no natural illness could explain. Both men had died within 4 years of each other, both certified as cerebral hemorrhage. December 30th, 1932. Pretoria, South Africa. Daisy De Melker was 46 years old. She had been a nurse. She was methodical, patient, and so careful that she eluded suspicion for nearly a decade while poisoning her way through 2 marriages and finally her own son. Her first husband, William Cowell, died in 1923 after Daisy prepared his Epsom salts. She collected insurance. Her second husband, Robert Sproat, died in 1927 during what appeared to be a sudden illness. She collected insurance. Then she married a 3rd time and turned her attention to her son, Rhodes, because he had become inconvenient. Rhodes was 20 years old. Daisy traveled to Turfontaine under the name Sproat, purchased arsenic from a chemist, and prepared a thermos of coffee for her son to take to work. He and a colleague both drank it. By Saturday, Rhodes was dead. Her first two husbands had been acquitted in court. The judge ruled the strychnine evidence wasn't conclusive enough. It was Rhodes's death that finally convicted her. The chemist recognized her photo in a newspaper and went directly to police. The arsenic was in the flask, in the boy's hair, in his fingernails. "I am not guilty of poisoning my son," she told the judge as sentence was read. She was hanged at Pretoria Central Prison on the morning of December 30th, 1932. She had been declared insolvent after paying for her own legal defense. She was buried in a pauper's grave. Her ghost is said to haunt the children's hospital ward in Johannesburg. When a door slams unexpectedly, people say, "That was Daisy." In the era when most of these women committed their crimes, a man could ensure the life of a child he had no biological connection to and collect the payout. Insurance companies issued policies on infants without a single home visit, no oversight, no verification. The system that was supposed to protect the most vulnerable members of society was, in practice, creating a financial incentive for their deaths. It took cases like these to change that. Before we continue, we need to ask you something real. Every case in this video involved someone who trusted the wrong person, a husband who trusted his wife, a mother who trusted a nurse, a traveler who trusted an innkeeper. Think about your own life for a second. Who do you trust completely? And would you even know if you were wrong? Drop your answer in the comments. We read all of them. And stay with us. The next 9 cases are the reason we made this episode. Case 11, Earl Dennison. She left the bedside of the dying child, drove 12 miles across the county, and renewed the girl's life insurance policy. The policy was set to expire the very next day. September 4th, 1953, Kilby Prison, Alabama, USA. Earl Dennison was 53 years old, and for over 25 years, she had been the chief surgical nurse at Wetumpka General Hospital. She was experienced, she was trusted. The Weldon family called her Aunt Earl. On May 1st, 1952, she paid a visit to the humble farmhouse where her niece's family lived in rural Elmore County. 2-year-old Shirley Diane Weldon greeted her at the door and climbed into her lap for a hug. Earl gave the child an orange soda. Then, when Shirley became violently ill, she told the mother it was just an upset stomach and offered her a Coca-Cola to settle it. She had laced both drinks with arsenic. While Shirley lay dying in the hospital, Earl drove to the insurance office and paid the premium on the girl's policy, $6,500 worth of coverage, before the midnight deadline. Shirley died 5 hours after first falling ill. Shirley's older sister, Polly Ann, had died under Earl's watch years earlier. On the same day Shirley was born. Earl had given Polly Ann a celebratory ice cream cone that day. Exhumation confirmed arsenic. When police came to arrest Earl the following morning, she swallowed an overdose of sleeping pills and had to be revived. When she finally confessed, Sheriff Hawley described her as cool as anyone could be. Governor Persons denied clemency, stating, "The poisoned child is just as dead as if the crime had been committed by a man." Earl Dennison was executed at midnight in Alabama's famous yellow wooden chair. She was the first white woman ever executed by the state of Alabama. The child's own love had been the weapon. Case 12, Elizabeth Fenning. She wore her wedding dress. That day, July 26, 1815, was the day she was supposed to be married. Instead, at 8 o'clock in the morning, she was hanged at Newgate in the white muslin gown with the lilac boots and the ribbon tied at the waist. July 26, 1815, London, England. Elizabeth Fenning was 20 years old. She had been a cook in the household of Mr. Orlebar Turner at 68 Chancery Lane for less than 6 months, when the household was struck by violent illness after eating dumplings she had prepared. The Turner family, father, son, and elderly grandfather, all suffered severe stomach pains and vomiting. So did Elizabeth. An arsenic packet kept in an unlocked office drawer to kill mice had gone missing. The surgeon found white residue at the bottom of the dumpling dish. Elizabeth was arrested. Her defense? She had also eaten the dumplings. She had also become ill. If she intended to poison the family, why had she consumed the very substance herself? Charles Dickens believed she was innocent. So did the poet Samuel Parr. So did roughly 10,000 Londoners who attended her funeral and lined the streets to mourn her as a martyr of a bloodthirsty legal system. The recorder's summary had been so biased against her that legal scholars debated it for decades. She had no legal counsel. At the time, defendants in capital murder cases were not permitted representation. She could not have known that morning was her execution day. She had written to her fiancé from prison not knowing the death sentence was coming the next day. They have brought me in guilty. I may be confined most likely 6 months at least. The executioner couldn't fit the proper hood over her head. He used his own dirty pocket handkerchief. She died almost without writhing. Her guilt has never been conclusively established. Case 13. Catherine Flanagan and Margaret Higgins. They were sisters. They lived in the same rooming house in the Liverpool slums. They were described as illiterate, drunk most of the time, and barely surviving. Wax effigies of them were placed in Madame Tussaud's Chamber of Horrors. March 3rd, 1884. Kirkdale Prison, Liverpool, England. Catherine Flanagan was 55 years old. Her sister Margaret Higgins was 41. Together, and possibly with a wider network of women in their neighborhood, they had poisoned at least 4 people for burial club insurance payouts. Catherine's own son, Margaret's young stepdaughter, a teenage lodger named Margaret Jennings, and Margaret's husband Thomas, a strong, healthy hod carrier who was dead within 3 days of falling mysteriously ill. The method was devastatingly simple. They soaked common fly papers in water and boiled off the arsenic residue. No chemist registry, no paper trail, just fly papers, a pot of water, and time. During the investigation, insurers discovered the sisters had presented a fake Thomas Higgins to an insurance agent to secure a policy on the real Thomas. The agent who signed the policy later sat and identified the real Thomas at the mortuary. They were not the same man. At trial, Catherine attempted to turn on her sister and offer testimony against a wider conspiracy of black widows across the Liverpool slums in exchange for her own life. The prosecution refused. Her testimony was contradictory. She was minimizing her own responsibility. 1,000 people watched both women hang at Kirkdale Prison on March 3rd, 1884. Wax effigies of both went into the Madame Tussaud's Chamber of Horrors within the year. Catherine went to the gallows, still trying to bargain her way out. The rope did not negotiate. The next woman on this list didn't poison anyone. What she did was far more personal. Case 14. Bridget Durgan. She allowed the dying woman one last thing before she finished her. She let her kiss the baby. August 30th, 1867. New Brunswick, New Jersey, USA. Bridget Durgan was 23 years old, an Irish immigrant who had come to America after being seduced by an employer's son in County Sligo and paid to leave the country. In New York, she became a housekeeper. In New York, she became pregnant by an unnamed gentleman and was thrown into the street. She gave birth in a charity hospital. She later described the moment she was evicted. From that moment, I began to hate everybody, but most of all, mistresses. I resolved to kill someone if only the chance came my way. She eventually found work in Newmarket, New Jersey, with the Coryell family, Dr. Coryell, his wife Mary Ellen, and their infant. She began fantasizing that if Mrs. Coryell were dead, she could run the household alone and care for the baby herself. She described the urge arriving instantly, like a flash of lightning. On the evening of February 26, 1867, Dr. Coryell left the house. Bridget attacked Mary Ellen Coryell and stabbing and clubbing her. During the assault, according to her own account, she paused. She allowed the bleeding, dying woman to kiss her baby one final time. Then she finished the job. She set the house on fire and fled to a neighbor's, wailing that robbers had killed Mrs. Coryell. There were no signs of forced entry. Investigators noted this immediately. Bridget's story collapsed within hours. She dictated a 30-page confession on the night before her execution, her full life story, and instructed her chaplain to publish it only after she was dead. She expected a reprieve because women were rarely executed. The reprieve never came. She was hanged on August 30th, 1867. The baby she had been willing to kill for survived. Case 15. Mary Blandy. She climbed a ladder to reach the gallows. It was draped in black cloth. She had a prayer book tied in her hands. Before the hangman placed the rope, she made one final request. April 6th, 1752. Oxford, England. Mary Blandy was approximately 32 years old. She was intelligent, articulate, well-bred, and described as having a sprightly and affable manner. She had poisoned her own father. Francis Blandy was a prosperous attorney who had publicly advertised his daughter's dowry as £10,000 to attract a good husband. When Mary was 26, a Scottish army captain named William Henry Cranstoun arrived. He was charming. He was from a noble family. He was also already married in Scotland, with children. Cranstoun sent Mary powders from Scotland, claiming they were an ancient love potion that would make her father more favorable to their union. Mary placed them in her father's tea and water gruel for weeks. Francis Blandy began to decline. A servant who accidentally consumed the remains of the poisoned food also became violently ill. Before he died, Francis Blandy looked at his daughter and told her he suspected her. She begged his forgiveness. He gave it, while pitying her. Cranstoun fled to France after the arrest. He joined a monastery. He died penniless 8 months after Mary's execution. He never faced justice. Mary, who maintained she believed the powder was a love potion, died alone, while the man who gave it to her lived freely. At the gallows, she asked the assembled crowd a final favor. Her famous last words, "Gentlemen, don't hang me high, for the sake of decency." She was afraid the young men in the crowd below would look up her skirts. She was hanged on April 6th, 1752. Cranstoun died on November 30th of the same year, in a monastery in France. Case 16, Mary Anne Geering. The exhumation took place in watery graves. When the coffins were opened, the effluvium was described as dreadful. Holes had to be bored into the wood to drain the water before the bodies could be lifted out and examined on the tombstones. August 21st, 1849. Lewes, England. Mary Anne Geering was 49 years old. She had lived with her husband Richard in a tiny cottage near Gesche for over 30 years. He was a laborer. She raised the children and ran the house. To all outward appearances, she was a devoted wife and mother. Between September 1848 and March 1849, 6 months, her husband Richard died. Then her 21-year-old son George died. Then her 26-year-old son James died. Each had suffered the same symptoms: rage and thirst, violent vomiting, cramping. Each death was attributed to illness. Then her youngest son Benjamin fell ill with unnatural hunger and vomitings. 2 physicians altered his diet. He recovered immediately. The recovery was the evidence. It meant the illness wasn't natural. Mary Anne had purchased arsenic from a Hastings chemist under the pretense of killing rats and treating horses. When Richard's small inheritance of 20 pounds came through from the savings bank, she drew it out within weeks of his death. She nursed each of her sons through their deaths, sitting at their bedsides day and night, the attentive, devoted mother, while poisoning them. James was nursed by his brother at night and by Mary Anne during the day. She administered the poison each morning. He deteriorated overnight without her help. He died on her shift. She confessed to the prison chaplain on the night before her execution. Between 3,000 and 4,000 people attended the hanging the following noon. The drop took approximately 2 minutes. The crowd showed no significant emotion in either direction. The victim who survived, Benjamin, provided the testimony that condemned her. Case 17. Sarah Harriet Dazzley. After the body was exhumed, the organs were remarkably well preserved. That was the first sign. Arsenic does that. It keeps the body intact long after everything else has decayed. Inside, clear and irrefutable evidence. August 5th, 1843. Bedford Jail, England. Sarah Harriet Dazzley was approximately 24 years old. She had auburn hair and large brown eyes, and had grown up in the village of Potton, Bedfordshire, the daughter of a barber who died when she was 7. She married her first husband, Simeon Mead, at 19. 7 months after their son Jonah was born, Jonah died. 3 months later, Simeon died. Sarah did the grieving widow performance for a few weeks before beginning a relationship with William Dazzley. She married William in February 1841. He drank heavily and sometimes hit her. She confided to a neighbor that she would kill any man who ever hit her. By October 1842, William was ill. Sarah made her own pills in the kitchen and replaced the doctor's medicine with them. When Anne Mead, Simeon's teenage daughter, now living with them, swallowed one to prove they were safe, she became violently ill. The family pig lapped up the vomit from the yard and died overnight. William died on October 30th, 1842. During the exhumation and Marsh test analysis, prosecutors held something in reserve: the murder of 7-month-old Jonah, her own infant son. It was never formally tried, but Judge Baron Alderson referenced it directly at sentencing, stating that what she had done showed total heartlessness, and that the jury knew what had also been done to that child. Thousands attended the hanging at Bedford Jail. Special Trains were reportedly laid on for spectators traveling from neighboring towns. Sarah was the only woman ever publicly hanged at Bedford Jail. She maintained innocence until the end. The next woman may actually have been telling the truth about that. Case 18. Mary Edmonson. She told the crowd she was going to die with as much pleasure as if I was going to sleep. Then the hangman placed the hood and the cart pulled away. April 2nd, 1759, Kennington Common, London, England. Mary Edmonson was 26 years old. She was described as a religiously minded young lady who had lived with her widowed aunt, Mrs. Walker, in Rotherhithe for 2 years, and during that time comported herself in the most decent manner. She attended church regularly. She had no prior history of violence. What happened to her aunt that February evening was, by every external indicator, completely out of character. On the evening of February 23, 1759, Mary escorted a family guest, Mrs. Toucher, to her door across the street and guided her home in the darkness. She returned to the house moments later. A woman selling oysters in the street heard someone cry out, "Help! Murder! They have killed my aunt." Mrs. Walker was found lying on her right side, her throat cut, her head near a table covered in linen. Mary told investigators 4 men had entered through the back. A tall man dressed in black had threatened to kill her if she spoke. When investigators searched the house, they found items Mary claimed had been stolen, still in the house, hidden in the privy beneath the floor. Her arm bore a cut she claimed came from the door, but investigators found the wound inconsistent with her account. The evidence was entirely circumstantial. No eyewitness, no weapon, just hidden goods and a wound that didn't match. She was convicted on March 31st and hanged 4 days later. She never confessed. On the scaffold, "I am innocent of the crime laid to my charge. I freely forgive my prosecutors." Her body was taken directly from the gallows to a hospital for dissection. We will never know. Case 19. Dovy Dean. She sat in the death house drinking coffee and declining cookies. The preacher offered to have someone sing her a hymn. She said she wanted "What a Friend We Have in Jesus." No one felt confident in their singing voice. The preacher read the words instead. She listened. Then she walked in. January 15th, 1954, Ohio State Prison, Columbus, Ohio, USA. Dovy Blanche Dean was 55 years old. She had been described consistently by everyone who encountered her as one thing: an ice queen. She had married her third husband, Hawkins Dean, a 69-year-old farmer, on April 13th, 1952, exactly 1 day after divorcing her previous husband, who was in jail at the time. Hawkins changed his will to make Dovy the sole beneficiary of his $27,000 estate shortly after the wedding. 5 months later, she poured arsenic into his milk on 4 separate occasions. When he grew ill, she called an ambulance, a detail she later used to argue her innocence. On August 22nd, 1952, Hawkins Dean died from the accumulated arsenic. The autopsy revealed bright red organs. When the sheriff told Dovy that her own son, whom she had initially accused of the murder, was devastated by the accusation, he challenged her. If a mother can make such a charge against her son, wouldn't she be capable of killing? Don't you want to change your story? Dovy replied, "And take the blame myself?" Pause. "Yes, I want to change my story. I did it." The jury took 40 minutes. Ohio law made death mandatory without a mercy recommendation. The jury gave none. In prison, she gained 30 pounds and kept a parakeet named Charlie. Every witness compared her calm to Anna Marie Hahn, Ohio's first, who died screaming. Dovy Dean was pronounced dead at 8:07 p.m. More placidly, one observer noted, than any prisoner I have ever seen. Case 20. Helen Ray Fowler. At 9 p.m. she dictated a final letter to the lieutenant governor, pleading for her life. At 11:04 p.m., they strapped her into the chair. At 11:17 p.m., she was declared dead. 8 minutes later, her co-defendant was executed in the same chair. The chair was still warm. November 16th, 1944. Sing Sing Prison, Ossining, New York, USA. Helen Ray Fowler was 37 years old. She ran a boarding house on Memorial Parkway in Niagara Falls, a street that sounded respectable and wasn't. On October 30th, 1943, a 63-year-old service station owner named William Fowler followed her home from a bar. He was carrying what appeared to be close to $1,000 in cash. He had been flashing it all day. What happened next became disputed. Helen said her boyfriend George Knight started a fight with Fowler and hit him with a vase. Knight said Helen urged him to deliver the final blow. What both agreed on, William Fowler ended up with a fractured skull on Helen's floor. They hid the body. They borrowed a serviceman's car. They put William in a trunk and dropped him off the North Grand Island Bridge into the Niagara River. 39 days later, the badly decomposed body washed up behind a power plant. The trial jury was historic, the first in Niagara County to include women, 5 of them. During deliberations, they asked the judge, could someone who didn't physically kill still be guilty? Yes, he confirmed. Under felony murder, both participants are equally liable. They deliberated less than an hour. Helen cried throughout her trial and burst into hysterics at the verdict. But when they led her to the chamber, witnesses said she was completely silent and composed. Helen Ray Fowler was the only black woman executed in New York State in the 20th century. Her name appears in almost no history books. Case 21, the last case, is the case this entire episode has been building toward. A mother's obsession, a daughter-in-law's fate, a last question that echoed off the walls of a gas chamber. Elizabeth Ann Duncan. As her execution approached, her son Frank was in San Francisco arguing her case before the U.S. Court of Appeals. He was still speaking when they led her to the chamber. She had only one question left. August 8th, 1962, San Quentin Prison, California, USA. Ma. Duncan was 58 years old, married at least 11 times, possibly 16. She had spent decades conning men across California. She considered herself the sole authority on her son Frank's life. Frank was an attorney. In June 1958, he secretly married a nurse named Olga Kupchik, 30 years old and 7 months pregnant by November. Elizabeth found out. She told Olga's apartment manager, "She is not going to have him. I will kill her." She spent months finding someone willing to carry it out. On November 13th, 1958, she met 2 men at a cafe and paid them $6,000. On November 17th at midnight, Olga answered her door, wearing a quilted robe. She was told Frank was drunk downstairs and needed help. She followed. She was beaten unconscious, driven 7 miles into Casitas Pass Road, strangled and buried. The coroner determined she was still alive when buried. Elizabeth had staged a fraudulent annulment, posing as Olga in open court. That forgery unraveled everything. At San Quentin on August 8, 1962, Elizabeth Ann Duncan was sealed into the gas chamber. Her last words were a question. The same one she had been asking since the day Frank married without telling her. "Where's Frank?" The chamber sealed. The crystals dropped. Frank was still in San Francisco arguing her case. He didn't make it. She was the last of 4 women executed in California's gas chamber. The rope was not being measured for anyone else that day. But somewhere, it always is. The methods changed across 5 centuries. The distance between the killer and the victim never did. They were always the closest person in the room. If this episode left a mark, it should. Drop your thoughts below. Share it with someone who won't sleep well tonight. And subscribe to Crime Lens, because part 3 exists, and it is worse. This has been Crime Lens. We'll see you in the next one.